He used to make girls scream. Not in fear, but in frenzy. Posters on bedroom walls, autograph lines down the block, fan clubs, letters, VHS tapes played until the film warped. Jonathan Brandis was everywhere and everything for a certain generation of American teenagers. Bright smile, deep eyes, that vulnerable, almost fragile kind of charm. Then at 27 years old, he was gone. Just like that. A rope, a closet, and silence. The newspapers called it unexpected. The industry barely blinked. And the fans, well, they never really got an answer. There was no long history of addiction, no explosive scandal, no suicide note. Only questions. And the uneasy feeling that something about his disappearance didn't feel like the whole story. Tonight, we're not here to gossip. We're here to remember, to rewind, to look again closely at a boy who grew up on sound stages in makeup chairs behind fake walls and scripted lives, and ask what happened when the cameras stopped rolling. This is the story of Jonathan Brandis, the rising star, the fading light, and the tragedy Hollywood didn't want to talk about. It started like a dream, as it always does. Jonathan Gregory Brandis was born on April 13, 1976, in Danbury, Connecticut, an only child. A small-town boy with big blue eyes and a quiet, almost adult stillness. The kind of kid who could sit through an entire adult conversation without speaking, but when he did speak, people listened. By the time he was 2, he was modeling. By 4, he was in TV commercials. At 6, his family packed up their life and moved to Los Angeles. He didn't grow into fame, he grew up inside it. He landed small roles, at first won Life to Live guest spots on Who's the Boss, Full House, The Wonder Years. But it was Stephen King's It in 1990 that changed everything. Jonathan played young Bill Denborough, the stuttering, grief-stricken leader of the Losers Club. And in that performance, people saw it. A depth that kids shouldn't know how to portray. A sadness behind the eyes. A stillness that felt too real. He was 14. The phone never stopped ringing after that. Movie deals, magazines, and then Sequest DSV. At just 17 years old, Jonathan Brandis became the star of one of NBC's biggest sci-fi series. He played Lucas Wollensack, a computer genius in a futuristic submarine. The role made him a teen idol overnight. Teen Beat, Tiger Beat, Bop. His face was everywhere. He was charming, well-spoken, and humble in interviews. He talked about writing scripts, directing someday. He wanted to be more than a cute face. And people believed he would be, but behind the scenes, things weren't simple. Jonathan didn't party. He wasn't reckless, he was careful. He didn't drink. He didn't fight the system. He tried to earn his place in it. He studied his lines obsessively, memorized entire scripts, wrote in journals every night. He once said in an interview, "I don't just want to act, I want to create, I want to last." He was thoughtful, introspective, a perfectionist in a machine that rarely rewards careful people. And then, like a glitch in the film reel, the light began to fade. Sequest was cancelled in 1996. He was just 20. Hollywood did what it always does with young stars when they outgrow their fan base. It moved on. Roles became fewer, leads became bit parts, scripts stopped coming. Jonathan kept trying. Indie films, voiceovers, auditions. He wrote screenplays, tried directing shorts, pitched projects no one picked up. He never got in trouble, he didn't overdose, he didn't lash out. He just got quiet. And for a boy who had once lived entirely in the spotlight, that quiet became unbearable. He said it once to a friend just in passing. "I peaked at 17, what do you even do after that?" By 2003, Jonathan was living in a modest apartment in West Hollywood. No entourage, no paparazzi, no more screaming fans. Just him, a few friends, and the echo of a life that used to be louder than this. It wasn't dramatic at first, that's what made it harder to see. There was no explosive moment, no scandal, no front page fall from grace. It was more like a slow dimming, like someone gradually turning down the volume on a person until you could barely hear them anymore. Jonathan still went to auditions, still answered fan mail, still smiled when people recognized him on the street. But something had shifted. His friends noticed he was sleeping more, eating less, leaving voicemails late at night, not slurred or manic, just heavy. He'd say things like, "I feel stuck. I don't know who I am without work. I just want one more role, one that matters." He still had the look, still had the talent. But casting agents saw him as a relic from the past, a 90s teen star, not a serious adult actor. One by one, doors closed. Callbacks didn't come. Meetings went nowhere. And then came Hearts War. It was supposed to be his return, a World War II drama starring Bruce Willis. Jonathan had a small but emotionally pivotal role, a chance to show depth-range maturity. He poured himself into it, rehearsed relentlessly, told friends this could change things. But when the film premiered in 2002, most of Jonathan's scenes had been cut. Not because he wasn't good, he was, but the studio trimmed runtime, and his character became collateral damage. No one told him in advance. He found out at the screening, in front of friends, in front of people who believed in him, one friend recalled. He just got up and walked out, quiet, didn't say a word. After that, he stopped talking about acting, stopped talking about anything really. Then came the journals. Jonathan had always kept notebooks filled with story ideas, sketches, poems. But in those last few months, the tone darkened. They weren't just scripts or ideas anymore, they were questions. Is this what it feels like to disappear? Would anyone notice if I stopped trying? How do you restart a life that no one wants to see? He didn't show them to many people. Only one or two close friends even knew they existed. But they later said reading them felt like wading into a fading signal, like listening to someone calling for help from beneath deep water. Jonathan also started drinking, not heavily, not publicly, but enough that his friends noticed. Enough that it dulled the sharpness that had once made him electric. One friend described it like this: he wasn't reckless, he was just tired. Like he was running on fumes and trying to coast as far as he could before it ran out. And yet, if you had seen him on the street in October 2003, you might have thought he was fine. He still smiled, still said thank you when fans stopped him, still answered texts, still showed up. But those closest to him knew he was unraveling quietly, politely, and out of sight. The last photo ever taken of Jonathan was from a low-res digital camera. He's standing on a sidewalk looking down at a coffee cup in his hand. He's wearing jeans, a hoodie, and that same quiet expression that made him famous. There's nothing wrong with the picture, but there's nothing alive in it either. Just stillness. Like someone waiting for a train they already know won't come. November 11th, 2003. A Tuesday. Unremarkable by every other account. Jonathan Brandis had plans that night. He spoke to a few friends, told one he'd been writing again, told another he might go out for a walk. No one heard anything unusual in his voice. Nothing alarming. Nothing that set off alarms. He lived in a modest apartment off Detroit Street, just blocks from the buzz of Sunset Boulevard. Not isolated, not forgotten. Still, fading. That night around 11:30 p.m. he locked his door, turned off the lights, and alone in the silence of his own home he hanged himself. It would be his landlord who found him the next morning, unresponsive, the rope still there, no note. Paramedics rushed him to Cedars-Sinai Medical Center. He was still breathing, barely, but he had been without oxygen for too long. The damage was done. On November 12, 2003, less than 24 hours after he was found, Jonathan Brandis was pronounced dead. There were no breaking news alerts, no candlelight vigils, no industry-wide mourning. Just a few lines buried in local columns. Jonathan Brandis, 27 actor best known for Sequest, died Wednesday in Los Angeles. Fans didn't know how to respond. Most didn't even know until days later. Some thought it was a hoax. Others assumed it was drugs because when a celebrity dies, young people want it to be something familiar, predictable. But toxicology reports showed no overdose, no foul play, no staged scene. Just a man, a rope, a moment he couldn't pull back from. The questions came quickly. Why was he depressed? Did anyone see it coming? But there were no easy answers. His parents released a short statement. Jonathan was a bright and loving young man. He left us far too soon. His former co-stars were stunned. Some spoke to press, most didn't. The silence around his death was palpable. No funeral photos, no TMZ spectacle, no celebrity tribute event, just grief and absence. Then came the private efforts. One friend who'd spoken to Jonathan just 2 nights before began digging, rereading old texts, looking through old photos. He didn't sound suicidal, they said. He still had dreams. He wanted to direct. He said he had an idea for something real. Another friend, an actor he'd known since his Nickelodeon days, confessed they'd seen the signs but didn't know what to do. He always brushed it off, always changed the subject. I thought he was just in a rough patch. I didn't know it was the end. People started asking, was Heart's War the trigger? Was it the stalled career, the loneliness? But nothing fit cleanly. Jonathan hadn't left a roadmap, only fragments, only half-finished journal entries and scripts never sent. A local entertainment reporter, one of the few who actually remembered him, wrote a piece called "Hollywood Forgot Jonathan Brandis." It wasn't sensational, it was quiet, painful, full of what-ifs. That article would be shared quietly online for years, on fan forums, Tumblr blogs, later Reddit threads titled "Stars We Lost Too Soon." Each post a digital candle, each comment a fragment of someone who still remembered. But official Hollywood, they moved on. There was no posthumous Oscar tribute, no clip reel, just silence. Which is how Jonathan lived at the end, and how he left. Not with a bang, but with a whisper. So soft most people never even heard it. In the weeks that followed Jonathan's death, there was no real investigation. There didn't need to be on paper. The cause was clear. The circumstances were private. The conclusion was tragic but tidy. No note, no message, no farewell. And because of that, no narrative. Hollywood, always hungry for a comeback or a crash, had no story to sell here. Jonathan hadn't spiraled in public. He hadn't made headlines. He hadn't made noise. He'd simply stopped. And the industry doesn't know what to do with that. The gossip columns moved on. New stars rose, new scandals bloomed. By Christmas of 2003, just 6 weeks after his death, Jonathan Brandis had already begun to vanish from the cultural memory. No Lifetime special, no studio tribute, no legacy reboot. Just an empty IMDb page with a too early end date and a fan forum that hadn't been updated in years. His parents never gave an extended interview. They never wrote a book, never tried to reframe the narrative. And maybe that was mercy. Or maybe it was grief too deep for words. In a rare comment to the Hartford Courant, his father said, "We miss him, that's all." Just that, nothing else, not a word more. But for the people who knew him, really knew him, the silence was unbearable. His former co-star from Sequest, Stephanie Beacham, later said in a private panel, "He was sensitive, so much more than people knew, and the business doesn't forgive that." Others echoed the same thing: he felt forgotten, not in a bitter way, but in a quiet, aching way, like someone realizing the world no longer had a place for them. And that hurt more than failure. In the years that followed, pieces of Jonathan's life surfaced here and there. A handwritten script mailed to an old friend, a voicemail left on a producer's phone that had never been deleted, a folder of sketches and ideas for a sci-fi show he wanted to pitch. It was called Echo Station, a story about a group of misfit travelers trapped in a space station trying to communicate with a world that no longer responded. One of the characters, a quiet engineer, was named Jonah. He had a stutter, and he was the only one on board who still believed they could be heard. No one bought the script. It never got past the outline phase. But those who read it said it felt personal, like Jonathan had written himself into space, far away, still listening, still hoping. The tragedy of Jonathan Brandis wasn't just how he died, it was how completely he disappeared after. Not just physically, but culturally. He didn't become a cautionary tale or a symbol or a martyr. He just faded. And in a city obsessed with image and impact, fading is the most unforgivable sin. There's an old saying in Hollywood, "You're only as good as your last role." Jonathan Brandis's last role was one no one saw, one that never aired, a voiceover for an animated pilot that never got picked up. It remains locked in a studio archive somewhere, his name misspelled in the metadata. No credits, no clips. Just a file labeled Unused Pilot #7 2003. Sometimes the world doesn't end with a bang or a scream. Sometimes it ends with a file someone forgot to delete. It was over a decade later, 2016 to be exact, when a piece of Jonathan's story quietly resurfaced. And it didn't come from a studio or a journalist or even a former co-star. It came from an eBay auction. A user was selling what they claimed to be Jonathan Brandis's personal journal. Leather-bound, scuffed edges, dozens of pages with sketches, poems, and dated entries. It caused a ripple in the online fandom that still existed mostly on forums, Tumblr, and obscure corners of Reddit. Some believed it was fake. Others were desperate to preserve it. The listing was taken down within hours. No one ever confirmed who bought it. But one of the screenshots captured just in time by a fan contained a page. A single dated entry, October 18th, 2003, just a few weeks before he died. The handwriting was unmistakable, verified by someone who owned a signed photo, and the entry read, "Sometimes I think I died already. I walk around and no one sees me. I smile and no one asks if it's real. I speak and it feels like soundless breath." Then beneath that, a simple line. "Maybe it's not that they forgot me. Maybe they never saw me in the first place." That entry hit something deep. People began posting tributes again. Blog posts, video essays, TikToks of grainy interviews and forgotten red carpet clips. The phrase, "maybe they never saw me in the first place," became a quiet anthem for those who'd ever felt invisible. Jonathan's story, once archived and boxed up, began to breathe again through the pain of others who saw themselves in his silence. Then came the podcast. In 2019, a former friend of Jonathan, an indie filmmaker named Kyle Denton, released a 6-part audio documentary called Ghost in the Frame, The Jonathan Brandis Story. It wasn't flashy, no music, no narration, just interviews, unedited, unpolished, phone calls, old voicemails, clips from screen tests, a few pages of a script Jonathan had co-written but never submitted. The final episode featured a voicemail Jonathan left Kyle 3 months before his death. The audio was grainy, barely audible. "Hey, it's me. I was just thinking about that idea, the quiet space one. I think there's something there, something honest. Call me when you can." That voicemail ended with a faint laugh, a sigh, and silence. The podcast was never picked up by a network, but it didn't need to be. It spread underground, shared in group chats, passed around Discord servers, reposted in mental health support forums. It wasn't just about Jonathan anymore. It was about the quiet ones, the people who almost made it, the ones who left behind just enough to remind us they were real. Then in 2020, something even quieter happened. A student at NYU Film School submitted a short script for their senior thesis. It was called Echo Station. Yes, the same name from Jonathan's old notes. The professor, curious, asked about the title. The student smiled. It's based on something I found online, a journal from someone who disappeared. I don't know why, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. When the professor pressed further, the student simply said, I think some people don't need us to remember them as stars. They just need us to remember they existed. And maybe that's what Jonathan left behind. Not a legacy, not a body of work, not a clean story, but a feeling, a flicker, a single unfinished sentence that stayed in the air long after he was gone. The story of Jonathan Brandis was never meant to have a twist. Not in the traditional sense. There was no hidden will, no secret diary confession that changed everything. But twists, the best ones, don't always explode. Sometimes they quietly flip the mirror. And suddenly, we see ourselves in the story we thought belonged to someone else. That twist came when Echo Station, the student film inspired by Jonathan's Fragments, won a small award at a regional festival in Vermont. The film was 10 minutes long, minimal dialogue, no dramatic score, just silent static and the low hum of loneliness in space. It didn't go viral. It didn't break any records. But one of the judges, a veteran Hollywood screenwriter, recognized the name Jonah in the script's character list. He'd worked briefly with Jonathan in the early 90s. Didn't know him well, but the name stood out. The handwriting style in the script, the formatting, the phrasing, it felt familiar. He emailed the student, curious. The student replied, I didn't write that part. I adapted it from something that was never finished. The screenwriter reached out to a producer friend. That producer reached out to an archive technician at NBC Universal. And that technician, bored during lockdown, finally opened a mislabeled digital archive from 2003. Unused Pilot #7. Inside was a partial script, some voiceover test audio, a time-stamped storyboard. It wasn't a full episode, but it was unmistakably Echo Station. And the voice delivering the opening monologue, Jonathan Brandis. The monologue was brief, distorted by time and file corruption. But this much was clear. They think we're dead. We're not. We're just quiet, just floating, still waiting to be heard. That line, that voice was the twist. Jonathan had been trying, not for fame, not for attention, but for resonance. He wasn't asking to be seen, he was asking not to be erased. The discovery prompted a few articles, not front page, but heartfelt. Vulture ran a piece titled, The Pilot Hollywood Never Aired and the Star It Forgot. Variety published a short tribute, remembering Jonathan Brandis, the silence in the frame. But what happened next wasn't about headlines. It was about permission. Suddenly, former child actors, ones who had quietly stepped away, began to speak. Not loudly, not for cameras, but in private interviews, in late-night podcasts, in art. They talked about pressure, about being praised before they understood what the praise even meant, about being watched so closely that they forgot how to watch themselves. Jonathan's story, it turned out, wasn't unique. That was the twist. He wasn't a tragic outlier, he was part of a pattern. A quiet epidemic of young lives hyperexposed, then discarded when their sparkle dimmed. And so the twist becomes a mirror. Jonathan didn't fail. The industry failed him. The audience. The machine. All of us who celebrated his talent then forgot to ask if he was okay when the lights dimmed. His death wasn't the end of his story. It was the final scene in a script that no one wanted to read past page 30. But buried in that scene was a message. Some stars don't go out, they just fall beneath the frame. And now, years later, the frame has widened, enough to let his voice back in, even if just for a moment. Even if just to say I was here. Jonathan Brandis didn't die from drugs. He didn't die from scandal. He didn't even die from a single devastating event. He died from erosion, from being worn away by 1,000 paper cuts that no one took seriously because he smiled, because he showed up, because he looked okay. But inside he was slowly dissolving. Let's talk about the psychology. Jonathan showed clear markers of what psychologists call invisible depression. It doesn't scream, it doesn't flail, it functions quietly, steadily, until it doesn't. People with invisible depression often overachieve. They mask. They become perfectionists. They fear being a burden, so they become flawless until the cracks begin to show. Jonathan was a textbook case. He memorized scripts obsessively, wrote alone late into the night, avoided confrontation, feared disappointing others. He once said in an interview, I don't want to let anyone down, ever. That sounds sweet. But in psychology, it's a warning sign. It's the internalization of worth. If I stop being valuable, I stop being visible. Then there's the child actor effect. Research shows that kids who grow up in fame often experience identity diffusion. They don't get to form a core self because they are constantly adapting to the roles the world gives them. For Jonathan, those roles were gentle, thoughtful, vulnerable. But what happens when no one wants that anymore? He couldn't play the tough guy, couldn't fake charisma, couldn't reinvent himself as an edgier version of his past. He was honest, and in Hollywood, that's not always an asset. In therapy, this kind of collapse is called unmirroring trauma. It happens when someone who was once highly valued for their looks, talent, charm, suddenly stops receiving that feedback. To the outside world, it looks like a career shift. To the person living it, it feels like erasure. They begin to wonder, was I ever loved, or just useful? For Jonathan, the shift was slow but fatal. From center stage to side character to silence. And no one rewrote the script for him, so he started to believe there wasn't one. But here's the cruel paradox. Jonathan didn't want attention. He wanted recognition. He wanted his work, his thoughts, his ideas to be taken seriously. He wasn't trying to be a star again. He was trying to be seen as a person. But the world had frozen him in a teen magazine smile. It couldn't reconcile the boy with the man, so it simply ignored the man. Psychiatrists call this legacy distortion, when someone's past success becomes a prison that blocks their present growth. Jonathan lived in that distortion. Everyone remembered who he was. No one was curious about who he was becoming. And that more than anything else is what breaks people. He didn't leave a note, but he left a pattern, one that we see in dozens of other young stars. River Phoenix, Brad Renfro, Lee Thompson Young, Sawyer Sweeten. All gifted, all lost too soon, all slipping beneath the surface while the world looked elsewhere. Jonathan Brandis wasn't weak. He was sensitive in a world that punished softness. He was thoughtful in a business that rewards loudness. He was real in a system built on illusion. And ultimately he was tired. Tired of auditioning for a place in a world that had already decided he was no longer needed. But what he couldn't see, what he didn't live to see, was that his story still mattered. Not because it was dramatic, not because it sold headlines, but because it was true. And in the end, truth is louder than applause. Jonathan Brandis didn't vanish in a storm. He slipped away like a final breath, unnoticed by most, unforgettable to a few. He didn't ask for pity, didn't cry out, didn't make a spectacle. He left behind silence. And in that silence, a question. What if the thing that breaks you isn't the fall, but the feeling that no one would notice if you did? We live in a world obsessed with survival stories, redemption arcs, second acts. But Jonathan's story doesn't have that. It has something rarer, something harder. It has truth and grief, and the ache of a life paused mid-sentence. You won't see his face on murals, you won't hear his name at award shows. But if you listen carefully in the static between commercials, in the quiet of a late-night rerun, in the hollow echo of a crowd long gone, you'll still hear him, still waiting, still hoping, still asking the only question that ever really mattered. Do you see me now? If this story stayed with you, if it echoed something in your own silence, then consider joining us here on Deep Dive. We tell the stories the world forgot, the ones that didn't end with applause, the ones that still whisper from behind the curtain. Subscribe, share, and leave a comment below. Tell us who else deserves to be remembered, because sometimes memory is the only justice left. Thank you for listening, thank you for seeing him, and thank you for keeping the light on.